Section 12, Part 1, Chapter 2 continued, of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Karl's sons, now 4 in number, used to circle around their grandparent like a humble chorus kept at a distance, and stared enviously at these gifts. In order to win his favor, they one day, when they saw him alone, came boldly up to him, shouting in unison, "Down with Napoleon!" "You insolent gringos!" ranted the old man. "That's what that shameless father has taught you. If you say that again, I'll chase you with a cat o' nine tails. The very idea of insulting a great man in that way!" While he tolerated this blonde brood, he never would permit the slightest intimacy. Desnoyers and his wife often had to come to their rescue, accusing the grandfather of injustice. And in order to pour the vials of his wrath out on someone, the old plainsman would hunt up Celedonio, the best of his listeners, who invariably replied, "Yes, patron, that's so, patron." "They're not to blame," agreed the old man, "but I can't abide them. Besides, they are so like their father, so fair, with hair like a shredded carrot, and the 2 oldest wearing specs, as if they were court clerks. They don't seem like folks with those glasses. They look like sharks." Madariaga had never seen any sharks, but he imagined them, without knowing why, with round, glassy eyes like the bottoms of bottles. By the time he was 8 years old, Julio was a famous little equestrian. "To horse, peoncito!" his grandfather would cry, and away they would race, streaking like lightning across the fields, midst thousands and thousands of horned herds. The peoncito, proud of his title, obeyed the master in everything, and so learned to whirl the lasso over the steers, leaving them bound and conquered. Upon making his pony take a deep ditch or creep along the edge of the cliffs, he sometimes fell under his mount, but clambered up gamely. "Ah, fine cowboy!" exclaimed the grandfather, bursting with pride in his exploits. "Here are $5 for you to give a handkerchief to some china." The old man, in his increasing mental confusion, did not gauge his gifts exactly with the lad's years, and the infantile horseman, while keeping the money, was wondering what china was referred to, and why he should make her a present. Desnoyers finally had to drag his son away from the baleful teachings of his grandfather. It was simply useless to have masters come to the house or to send Julio to the country school. Madariaga would always steal his grandson away, and then they would scour the plains together. So when the boy was 11 years old, his father placed him in a big school in the capital. The grandfather then turned his attention to Julio's 3-year-old sister, exhibiting her before him as he had her brother, as he took her from ranch to ranch. Everybody called Chicha's little girl Chichi, but the grandfather bestowed on her the same nickname that he had given her brother, the peoncito. And Chichi, who was growing up wild, vigorous and willful, breakfasting on meat and talking in her sleep of roast beef, readily fell in with the old man's tastes. She was dressed like a boy, rode astride like a man, and in order to win her grandfather's praises as fine cowboy, carried a knife in the back of her belt. The two raced in the fields from sun to sun, Madariaga following the flying pigtail of the little Amazon as though it were a flag. When 9 years old, she, too, could lasso the cattle with much dexterity. What most irritated the ranchman was that his family would remember his age. He received as insults his son-in-law's counsels to remain quietly at home, becoming more aggressive and reckless as he advanced in years, exaggerating his activity as if he wished to drive death away. He accepted no help except from his harum-scarum peoncito. When Karl's children, great hulking youngsters, hastened to his assistance and offered to hold his stirrup, he would repel them with snorts of indignation. "So you think I'm no longer able to help myself, eh? There's still enough life in me to make those who are waiting for me to die, so as to grab my dollars. chew their disappointment a long while yet." Since the German and his wife were kept pointedly apart from the family life, they had to put up with these allusions in silence. Karl, needing protection, constantly shadowed the Frenchman, improving every opportunity to overwhelm him with his eulogies. He never could thank him enough for all that he had done for him. He was his only champion. He longed for a chance to prove his gratitude, to die for him if necessary. His wife admired him with enthusiasm as the most gifted knight in the world, and Desnoyers received their devotion in gratified silence, accepting the German as an excellent comrade. As he controlled absolutely the family fortune, he aided Karl very generously without arousing the resentment of the old man. He also took the initiative in bringing about the realization of Karl's pet ambition, a visit to the fatherland. So many years in America, for the very reason that Desnoyers himself had no desire to return to Europe. He wished to facilitate Karl's trip and gave him the means to make the journey with his entire family. The father-in-law had no curiosity as to who paid the expenses. "Let them go," he said gleefully, "and may they never return." Their absence was not a very long one, for they spent their year's allowance in 3 months. Karl, who had apprised his parents of the great fortune which his marriage had brought him, wished to make an impression as a millionaire, in full enjoyment of his riches. Elena returned radiant, speaking with pride of her relatives, of the baron, colonel of the hussars, of the captain of the guard, of the councillor at court, asserting that all countries were most insignificant when compared with her husband's. She even affected a certain condescension toward Desnoyers, praising him as a very worthy man, but without ancient lineage or distinguished family, and French besides. Karl, on the other hand, showed the same devotion as before, keeping himself submissively in the background when his brother-in-law, who had the keys of the cash box and was his only defense against the brow-beating old patron. He had left his 2 older sons in a school in Germany. Years afterwards they reached an equal footing with the other grandchildren of the Spaniard who always begrudged them their existence. Perfect frights with carroty hair and eyes like a shark. Suddenly the old man became very lonely, for they had also carried off his second peoncito. The good Chicha could not tolerate her daughters growing up like a boy, parading round on horseback all the time and glibly repeating her grandfather's vulgarities. So she was now in a convent in the capital, where the sisters had to battle valiantly in order to tame the mischievous rebellion of their wild little pupil. When Julio and Chichi returned to the ranch for their vacations, the grandfather again concentrated his fondness on the first, as though the girl had merely been a substitute. Desnoyers was becoming indignant at his son's dissipated life. He was no longer at college, and his existence was that of a student in a rich family who makes up for parental parsimony with all sorts of imprudent borrowings. But Madariaga came to the defense of his grandson. Ah, the fine cowboy! Seeing him again on the ranch, he admired the dash of the good-looking youth, testing his muscles in order to convince himself of their strength, and making him to recount his nightly escapades as ringleader of a band of toughs in the capital. He longed to go to Buenos Aires himself, just to see the youngster in the midst of this gay, wild life. But alas, he was not 17 like his grandson. He had already passed 80. "Come here, you false prophet. Tell me how many children you have. You must have a great many children, you know." "Father," protested Chicha, who was always hanging around, fearing her parents' bad teachings. "Stop nagging at me!" yelled the irate old fellow in a towering temper. "I know what I'm saying." Paternity figured largely in all his amorous fancies. He was almost blind, and the loss of his sight was accompanied by an increasing mental upset. His crazy senility took on a lewd character, expressing itself in language which scandalized or amused the community. "Oh, you rascal! what a pretty fellow you are!" he said, leering at Julio with eyes which could no longer distinguish things except in a shadowy way. "You are the living image of my poor dead wife. Have a good time, for Grandpa is always here with his money. If you could only count on what your father gives you, you would live like a hermit. These Frenchies are a close-fisted lot. But I am looking out for you, peoncito. Spend and enjoy yourself. That's what your granddaddy has piled up the silver for." When the Desnoyers children returned to the capital, he spent his lonesome hours in going from ranch to ranch. A young half breed would set the water for his shrub tea to boiling on the hearth, and the old man would wonder confusedly if she were his daughter. Another, 15 years old, would offer him a gourd filled with the bitter liquid and a silver pipe with which to sip it. A grandchild, perhaps. He wasn't sure, and so he passed the afternoons silent and sluggish, drinking gourd after gourd of shrub tea, surrounded by families who stared at him with admiration and fear. Every time he mounted his horse for these excursions, his older daughter would protest. At 84 years, would it not be better for him to remain quietly at home? Some day something terrible would happen. And the terrible thing did happen. One evening the Patron's horse came slowly home without its rider. The old man had fallen on the sloping highway, and when they found him he was dead. Thus died the centaur as he had lived, with the lash hanging from his wrist, with his legs bowed by the saddle. A Spanish notary, almost as old as he, produced the will. The family was somewhat alarmed at seeing what a voluminous document it was. What terrible bequests had Madariaga dictated! The reading of the first part tranquilized Karl and Elena. The old father had left considerable more to the wife of Desnoyers, but there still remained an enormous share for the Romantica and her children. "I do this," he said, "in memory of my poor dead wife, and so that people won't talk." After this came 86 legacies. 85 dark-hued individuals, women and men, who had lived on the ranch for many years as tenants and retainers, were to receive the last paternal munificence of the old patriarch. At the head of these was Celedonio, whom Madariaga had greatly enriched in his lifetime for no heavier work than listening to him and repeating, "That's so, Patron, that's true." More than $1 million were represented by these bequests in lands and herds. The one who completed the list of beneficiaries was Julio Desnoyers. The grandfather had made special mention of this namesake, leaving him a plantation to meet his private expenses, making up for that which his father would not give him. "But that represents hundreds of thousands of dollars," protested Karl, who had been making himself almost obnoxious in his efforts to assure himself that his wife had not been overlooked in the will. The days following the reading of this will were very trying ones for the family. Elena and her children kept looking at the other group as though they had just waked up, contemplating them in an entirely new light. They seemed to forget what they were going to receive in their envy of the much larger share of their relatives. Desnoyers, benevolent and conciliatory, had a plan. An expert in administrative affairs, he realized that the distribution among the heirs was going to double the expenses without increasing the income. He was calculating, besides, the complications and disbursements necessary for a judicial division of 9 immense ranches, hundreds of thousands of cattle, deposits in the banks, houses in the city, and debts to collect. Would it not be better for them all to continue living as before? Had they not lived most peaceably as a united family? The German received this suggestion by drawing himself up haughtily. No, to each one should be given what was his. Let each live in his own sphere. He wished to establish himself in Europe, spending his wealth freely there. It was necessary for him to return to his world. As they looked squarely at each other, Desnoyers saw an unknown Karl, a Karl whose existence he had never suspected when he was under his protection, timid and servile. The Frenchman, too, was beginning to see things in a new light. "Very well," he assented. Let each take his own. That seems fair to me." End of Project Gutenberg EBook of Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico.